1910, a man known as Tomokachi Fukurai, a Japanese psychology professor, would encounter a little-known phenomenon that he would later term thoughtography, which is the alleged ability to burn one's mental images onto photographs. Fukurai had actually encountered this ability purely on accident when he was working with a self-proclaimed clairvoyant. He would, upon discovering this ability, begin experimenting to try and prove that thoughtography was a real thing. Unfortunately, he was heavily criticized by the scientific community, and the university he was employed by began to feel the pressure and asked him to stop his research, and then asked him to resign, and Japan stopped all pursuit of this phenomenon. Europe and American institutions, however, did dabble in the research some in the years after, but it was almost always exposed as a fraud. That is, until the 1950s, when our mystery would begin with a man named Ted Serios. See, in the previous decades when this research took place, many skeptics were able to point out just how easily it was to manipulate photographs during the time they were developed in the darkroom. This allowed the people in the experiments to pretty much print photos in whatever way they wanted, kinda like an old version of Photoshop, thereby jeopardizing the legitimacy of the so-called thoughtography experiments. But as the 1950s rolled around, the game had changed. No longer was a darkroom needed. Now a new system called Polaroid allowed for the almost instantaneous development of photographs, which brings in our mystery man, Ted Serios. Ted was a 30-something-year-old elevator operator who worked for a hotel in Chicago and had taken an interest in hypnosis and began performing his own experiments. It was in this research that Ted found that he could produce images onto photographs just by focusing on them in his mind. Ted, of course, was stunned with this development and began to show his friends, and then to various other people he knew, which included some researchers in Chicago, and it wasn't long before he started to get interest on a national level. Soon, a Denver psychiatrist and psychical researcher, Joel Eisenbud, would contact Ted, and after meeting with him, he wanted to research more into Ted's ability, so he would conduct and supervise thousands of tests with around 100 different observers, usually other scientists, and in these tests, he would come up with around 1,000 Polaroid photographs, and 400 of them contained images Ted allegedly pictured in his head. The photographs were somewhat blurry, but were recognizable, and most of the time, they were of buildings. One of the more interesting cases came when Ted, who was in a different room 30 feet away, was able to focus on the French Chateau Maintenon. Ted wasn't particularly interested in this at all, and instead focused on the arrival of the spacecraft Mariner 4 in the vicinity of Mars. When the photo came out, instead of the French Chateau, a bottle-shaped object that looked like the spacecraft Mariner 4 came out. Finally, the most interesting and mysterious part is the development of hundreds of photos the doctor called blackies and whiteys. In these pictures, the blackies were obviously pictures that were dark, and the whiteys were images with bright light. The tricky part was, the dark images were taken in rooms of light, while the images of bright light were taken in the dark. There was never an explanation for this. Finally, the last picture developed in the research came about when Ted produced an image of curtains. Eisenbud would take this to mean that the curtain had fell on the 3-year project, and it was time to end the experiment. By this point, Ted had lost the ability to produce mental images on Polaroids anyways, although he could still at times produce blackies and whiteys. But the question remains, how exactly was Ted able to do all this? Did he really have a gift? Or was it like the skeptics suggested? He was somehow manipulating the film. Well, right off the bat, they pointed to this instrument that Ted liked to call a gizmo. It was really a rolled paper tube about an inch in diameter. It usually was created during the experimental session from the black paper that came from the Polaroid film. Ted would hold it in front of the camera lens with his thumb and forefinger, as he claimed it helped him focus on the image. From there, he would direct the camera to his forehead and triggered the exposure with a signal. Skeptics, however, claimed that he was using this gizmo to conceal a transparent image which was then projected onto the film. They also noted his intense physical reactions during the process, such as concentration, shaking, and bloodshot eyes were all part of the act, although the bloodshot eyes might actually be because Ted was drunk at a lot of these experiments. Many people that read the skeptic's claims then wrote Ted off as nothing more than another phony. But curiously, the skeptics that made these allegations turned down Eisenbud's challenge to prove their claims. Very few would actually try to debunk Ted, and the ones that did try to could not do it. Regardless, they kept burying the whole thing as nothing more than a magic trick by Ted. But that overlooks the key part in all of this. Ted, in these experiments, was producing around 70 images per session, so even if he had been concealing images in his so-called gizmo, how was he doing it 70 plus times per session, while being watched by numerous scientific observers? Not to mention, the gizmo was examined before, during, and after the experiments, and not once did they ever find any images or devices hidden in the gizmo. Secondly, the observers would often withhold the gizmo from Ted right until the photo was taken, and then they took it back from him and inspected it, and held it again right until the photo was taken. Again, pretty much ruling out any trickery. And this doesn't even take into account several times the tests were taken in complete darkness. But maybe the most important part in all this was Ted was able to create more than 36 images when he was separated from the camera at a good distance, sometimes around 70 feet away. This happened at least 12 times and was observed by 14 different witnesses, many who triggered the Polaroid themselves. They also moved Ted to 9 different rooms, and he was still able to pull it off. And finally, it should go without saying, but if Ted was hiding a transparent image in the gizmo, he would have to hold it less than an inch from the lens to capture it. Otherwise, the Polaroid would only see the gizmo itself. Skeptics still did not buy it though, even after the experimenters started making Ted strip down and put on clothes brought in from the outside, in an attempt to separate him from anything he might be concealing in his clothes, and he was still able to do it. Eisenbud obviously believed in spite of the skeptics. He also believed the distortion of the pictures produced by Ted came via the basic dynamics of PSI, the unknown factor of extrasensory perception. One key example of this actually came from a photo Ted produced of Eisenbud's ranch. Using a fresh pack of film, Ted at first produced some blackies and barely formed images, until he finally produced a recognizable photo of Eisenbud's property, seen here. What was interesting was the photo Ted produced was not of how Eisenbud's ranch looked at the time. Instead, it looked like the house and ranch once had looked long ago, before Ted ever seen it. For example, there's no shutters on the windows, which years ago, the house did not have shutters, but had been added later on by Eisenbud. Then, there was the fact that Ted's image showed no door on the lower left. Instead, it was solid white, which in the real image, if both parts of the Dutch doors had been closed, it would have been solid white, although the dark borders would have been visible. In the decades since, no one has been able to reproduce these images nor debunk them, even though many skeptics have tried. There's even been a few famous ones come forward and agree to do the same exams and create similar photos, thus debunking Ted and Eisenbud. Yet, when it came right down to the moment to expose them, the skeptics always backed out, citing various reasons as to why doing so. However, 2 of these skeptics, Charlie Reynolds and David Eisendrath, claim they were able to observe Ted work, and after spending the weekend watching him, caught him slipping something into the tube, and when they caught him out on it, Ted said it helped him concentrate. While a professor, W.A.H. Rushton, claimed he was able to replicate the trick by holding a little reflecting prism that contained a microfilm up against the camera lens. Another magician, Percy Diaconis, claimed he caught Ted sneaking a small marble with a photograph on it into the little tube attached to the front of the camera he used. But his most famous opponent was stage magician The Amazing Randy, who claimed he was able to reproduce it holding a tiny magnifying lens at one end of the so-called gizmo, and then a 35mm slide of a photo. When lined up properly, the image was projected on the piece of transparency onto the film of the Polaroid. It was so tiny you could hide it in the palm of your hand, even while the larger so-called gizmo was still visible. However, the Amazing Randy refused to participate in these tests that would have shown he really could debunk Ted, even going as far to agree and then back out several times at the last minute, adding doubts to his claims. Although, he did state that backstage at some TV show, he debunked Ted to his face. But this brings up another issue. 4 different skeptics gave 4 different takes on how Ted was doing it, meaning they themselves were just making wild guesses. August 7th, 1973, Fontana, California. A woman named Darlene Ross was spending time doing one of her favorite hobbies, that of chatting on a CB radio. It was around 6:30 that evening when she would hear a voice that shocked her. It was that of a young boy who cried out, "Help, please help me." Darlene, taken aback, would soon begin trying to settle the boy down. She would ask for more information, like his name and what exactly was wrong. The boy said that his father was dead. Darlene, who was trying to do everything she could to find the boy and get him help, would note at one point she heard him plea, "Come on, David, help me," and then afterwards spent the rest of the day crying. Darlene would tell this boy to make sure and stay on the radio so she could try and find him. It was then that this boy finally identified himself as Larry, and the story of Lost Boy Larry would begin. After giving his name, he would tell Darlene that his location was New Mexico, and then the signal began to fade away, and Darlene could no longer reach Larry. But thankfully, Darlene had actually lived in Albuquerque at one point and was familiar with the area. She immediately called state authorities and turned over the information Larry had given her. She then contacted a local Albuquerque newspaper to get the story out, and the next morning, the news was released and became a big story in the area. And it wasn't long after that other people reported their accounts of talking to Larry. Some were as far away as Long Beach, California, and it's here that I must clarify, these CB radios at the time barely had the strength to cast the signal out past the state line, so the fact that Larry could be heard in Long Beach while transmitting from New Mexico, well, it was odd. But it was apparently due to the weather that week, which fortunately for Larry created perfect conditions to allow the signal to skip much further away. The kid's frightful pleas and crying were heard all over, as far as east as Mississippi and as far as north as Canada. New Mexico authorities started preparing a search and rescue operation, while other CB operators began listening and conversing with Larry. One of these, Alinda King, was able to get more information from Larry, and she would become the main point of contact. According to Larry, his father had died after flipping his pickup truck, and now Larry was stuck inside the vehicle next to his dead father with no food and water. He also revealed he was only 6 years old and did not know how to properly use the CB radio. Of course, this left many people in the area concerned for Larry, and later that day, the search officially began and involved the New Mexico State Police, the New Mexico Wing Civil Air Patrol, and the Albuquerque Citizens Radio Association, or ARCA for short. The latter group believed Larry was in the southern region of New Mexico after several locals in contact with him gave their accounts. So the Civil Air Patrol in response flew several aircraft over the southern part of the state, as well as southeastern Arizona. These planes were equipped with radio direction finders. The state police and ARCA started preparing to hike the foothills of Sandia Mountains, southeast of Albuquerque. The state police also stayed in contact with Larry, but it didn't seem to help, as they could not coax out the information needed to find him. In fact, Darlene Ross, the woman who first made contact with him, would tell the press that Larry apparently was not familiar with the area they were at, nor any of the surrounding towns. And it's about this time that police started to give consideration to the fact that this whole thing might be a hoax. However, they were not ready to throw the towel in just yet. Radio operators believed that Larry's signal was coming from Tijeras Canyon, part of the broader Albuquerque area, so the ground searchers got together there to start another search. Meanwhile, helicopters and an airplane were brought in to help. The airplane specifically had its pilot stay in contact with Larry from the cockpit's radio. Again, none of this helped, though an abandoned truck was found in the mountains. When checked, no one was inside. As the daylight hours were almost gone, Larry told searchers it was now raining where he was, and curiously, the 4th of July canyon in the Manzano Mountains was actually experiencing rain at the time, so searchers went to the area, They would also tell Larry to yell into his microphone if he happened to see the lights from an aircraft above, and Larry did just that, as the aircraft flew over the small community of Chalili, and when searchers made it to that area, again, nothing was found. As the sun ceased for the day, the leaders of the Air Patrol stated they could not rule out the possibility of it all being a hoax, but he was still convinced from the kids crying that it had to be real, which would be sad if true, because the next day it got really hot in Albuquerque, up into the 90s, but the search carried on, and this is when things began to take a bad turn, because now a ton of people got on their CB and began calling out for Larry, which made it difficult for Larry to communicate with Linda King, the main point of contact. Even worse was other children using walkie-talkies began to impersonate Larry, adding much confusion. Of course, this brought out a number of other people as well, such as a psychic calling in offering advice, while a church in Kansas said they received a message about where Larry was, and another woman from Maryland called in to say she had gotten lost in a park in that area previously and that they should check there. These tips all failed, obviously. But adding some validity to Larry's story was two separate families from out east, both called in to say they had sons named Larry traveling west whom they had lost contact with. However, in both cases, the families were able to get back into contact. By the third day, the search was now a disaster. The search groups were now getting conflicting reports of where Larry might be, and on top of this, Larry's broadcast was marked with a weakening signal strength, which indicated the CB radio of the truck was running out of battery life. To make matters worse, a CB operator in Phoenix stated a boy named David told him he was injured but outside the overturned truck, and that his father was not dead, only injured. And if you remember at the beginning of this wild saga, Larry was talking to a David, so now searchers wondered if David might be Larry's brother or a friend. However, searchers now began to doubt any of the so-called Larry transmissions that came from other states, considering so many of them were heard versus the lower amount heard in New Mexico. Not only that, Larry, although reportedly only 6 years old, should have known basic information to get rescued, yet it was almost like he was evasive at points. And finally, the battery should have never lasted to Thursday in the first place. By this point, authorities were getting annoyed. No one was coordinating anything, and it began to look more and more like a hoax than anything. By Saturday, aircraft equipped with radio finders would sweep the area again, but radio traffic was so heavy now that it didn't do any good, and the following day, the fake Larrys were all traced down and ruled out, including the so-called David, who was a young boy just playing around. By this point, if Larry was ever real, he was most likely dead from dehydration, and the search was called off that night. 4 directional finders were left to operate over the following weeks, but nothing came of it. In total, over 200 people spent 5 days conducting one of the largest search and rescue operations in that region of the country. It was the most expensive in New Mexico history, costing around the equivalent of $500,000 in today's money. So we're left with the mystery. Was it real or a hoax? Strangely, authorities in Colorado, a state that borders New Mexico, was pretty quick to call the whole thing a hoax. They had helped search the border and were pretty vocal early on that they believed Larry was in no danger at all. It was also pointed out later on that the area where the signal was allegedly coming from was searched extensively and found no credible evidence. And maybe one clue that is often overlooked, if the truck was turned over like Larry claimed, the antenna for the CB would have most likely been broken, although that's not a guarantee. However, there are still some who believe that Larry was indeed in a life and death situation looking for help, and there is one really good indicator that this might be true. Larry spent hours, practically all day after first making contact, just sobbing. He cried and cried most of the day, which leads to the question, if this was not a real emergency, how could a child, especially one that young, be far enough away from his parents all day long crying and using the CB radio, all the while the parents never once checked on him, unless the parent was in on it, but even that seems like a stretch. Is it really conceivable you could get a 6-year-old to cry all day long for strangers over the radio and then play along the next 3 days? It doesn't seem likely. The age is also contested. Many of the people that heard Larry were convinced he was not 6, and was probably closer to 4, which might explain why he wasn't able to give more details about where he was at. And it's also just possible he lied about his age because his parents had told him previously you had to be older to play on the CB radio, or something like that. If it was real, then the tragic conclusion is that they died in the desert and haven't been located yet, although some speculate that they were found and Larry never told anyone about using the radio, and that whoever rescued them had not heard the story about Lost Boy Larry and never connected the two, although that seems very unlikely. But let me know in the comment section below, was Larry real or a hoax? May 26th, 2012, Miami, Florida. A 31-year-old mostly nude man named Rudy Eugene would approach a 65-year-old man, Ronald Popo, around 1:55 p.m. Popo, who was homeless, was laying underneath a people mover viaduct when Rudy, for some reason, just began to assault him. He then stripped off his pants, but maybe most perplexingly, he began to bite his face. That would be the story that would become an international headline as Rudy continued to try and devour this man's face. The attack went on for close to 20 minutes until an officer arrived on the scene and was noticeably disturbed, would order Rudy to stop. And Rudy only turned to face this officer and growled and continued to devour his victim. The officer would then shoot Rudy once, and there was no effect. He would fire another 4 times, killing Rudy and stopping the attack. Ronald Popo survived, but lost about 75% of his face above the beard. He would get a major reconstruction surgery, but remain permanently disfigured and blind. Soon, the sensationalized headlines told the story of the Florida zombie, and of course, many people questioned why it happened in the first place, which led to the obvious speculation. What kind of drugs was this man on? Well, about that, although the media spoke about the street drug bath salts being involved, this was actually never confirmed, and was mainly just speculated by police. In fact, the only thing the toxicology report found was cannabis, although a number of undigested pills were found in Rudy's stomach. Many authorities claimed that the negative test results were not 100% conclusive, and a few toxicologists stated that Rudy's behavior was very consistent with bath salts. Others, of course, claimed that Rudy just had a severe mental illness, and going by his past, that was probably accurate, as well as the fact that he was a drug addict. But the mystery is not about Rudy or this incident per se, because just 4 years later, in August 2016, 19-year-old Florida State student Austin Haroof would do the same thing, this time stabbing to death a Michelle and John Stevens. When neighbor Jeff Fisher heard their screams, he rushed over to see Austin eating the flesh off of John's face. Austin would then stab him too, but Jeff escaped and called the authorities. This time, the perp was taken alive, although not easily. It took a stun gun, 4 deputies, and a K9 just to get him off the victim, and even then, Austin kept growling and making animal noises. The sheriff later stated they would have shot him if it wasn't for the fear of hitting the victim, as they didn't know John was deceased at that point. And it's here we go back to the cause. Law enforcement immediately speculated that it was caused by bath salts. However, a toxicology report revealed that he in fact was not on bath salts. It was soon that Austin's father would go on Dr. Phil and stated that drugs had nothing to do with it, and he later revealed that schizophrenia ran in his family and he believed Austin was affected. And the data does show that around Austin's age is when symptoms of schizophrenia first start appearing. During the trial, Austin was found insane and sentenced to a mental facility, although the sister of victim Michelle Stevens during the victim impact stated the numerous calls and text messages that were part of court record revealed that Austin was not only sane, but he abused drugs and alcohol, leading to the attacks. But let's get to the heart of this mystery. Some speculate that the bath salts excuse is just that, an excuse, but so is mental illness. They instead claim that these zombie incidents, which both took place in the 2010s and in Florida, are an example of possession, that somehow, someone else was able to come into control of both of these men, and at these moments ordered them to attack random people and consume their flesh. These two men then, acting nothing more as zombies, followed the orders in a blank state. In the first case, Rudy was killed by an officer before he could snap out of it, while Austin was not out of it until days later. Of course, it is just a wild theory on this crazy iceberg, and there's nothing really to support this claim, and it could just as well be mental illness. If you have followed the channel for a while, you have no doubt heard me and my fascination with ghost lights, often known as will-o'-the-wisp, which can take on various shapes, such as a ball of light, or even looking like flames, or even multiple small lights floating around in a forest with no explanation. You have probably heard me joke about the skeptics who always claim that it was nothing more than swamp gas, but there are other theories that try to explain the ghost light phenomenon, and maybe we shouldn't be surprised that at least one of these theories comes from our friends, the cryptozoologist, whose theory is one of the more interesting, dare I say, believable ones. The barn owl is a beautiful animal that many of us have seen, noted for its pure white chest and belly, that many owl experts believe is a kind of camouflage for night hunting, allowing it to hide its silhouette against the background of a light sky when viewed from below. Then we have the snowy owl from the Arctic region, whose bright white chest stands out as it flies above hunting at sundown. These two owls' white plumage acts in a way that causes it to reflect light. But just what if what we are seeing is not actually a reflection of light, and instead, these owls are actually emitting light? That's right, some cryptozoologists believe that these so-called ghost lights are really owls who have the ability to emit a white light from their chest. And I know you're thinking that is crazy, but this is an oddity that has been reported for a long time. And when I say long time, I mean going back to the 1st century AD, when one of the most famous naturalists, Pliny the Elder, would record he's seen a glow-in-the-dark bird in the Hercynian forest. Although Pliny was one of the most respected scholars ever, his report on this bird would be the only one for a very long time, which means he could have just been mistaken. But other sightings did occur nearly 2 millennia later in a seaside county of Norfolk in England. Beginning in 1897, a gamekeeper named Frederick Rolfe would record seeing a bright blue light fly past him in a village called West Bilney. He returned with a gun a few nights later and shot at the light to see it crash to the ground. He ran over quickly to discover the light was a dead barn owl. The following year, a local newspaper would record a story of a man named Edward Cannell who saw something bright shining on the grass. He would sneak up and catch the owl and was stunned to see that it was still bright and shining. He decided to take it indoors where it soon died from natural causes. But maybe the most credible sighting from this time period came from naturalist Sir Thomas Digby Pigott in 1907, who described a luminous barn owl which had been spotted by several residents. Its glow was compared to that of a bicycle light, which could have been seen about 300 to 400 yards away and was bright enough to illuminate the branches of the tree in which the owl was perched. The following year, John Henry Gurney Jr., an ornithologist, someone who studies birds, stated that the luminous barn owls are a confirmed reality, and coming from Gurney, who was one of the top researchers in the field, well, he gave it a lot of credence. But it wasn't just Norfolk. Letters began to pour in from all over of people having seen luminous owls themselves. One letter from Shropshire even stated a pair of luminous owls were seen there so common that the residents began calling them lantern birds. Even in Ireland, a story came in which a ferryman pointed to a pair of moving lights on the shore and stated they were birds. The passenger remarked it looked like the lights of cyclists riding along the road, until one of them changed direction and flew across the river. Most importantly, the witness stated the glow only came from the front, suggesting it was coming from the chest of the owl. But do owls really have the ability to emit a bright white light from its chest? As it may not surprise you, most have doubted these reports. However, some were more open to the idea, although they pitched more plausible theories, such as the owl coming into contact with a phosphorescent fungi known to glow, which grew on tree stumps. Others suggest a fungal infection of the owl itself, since this has been documented to happen to geese before, in which it affected their feathers. This might also explain why some of the reports claimed the owls looked sick, or why the one captured by Edward Rolfe died so quickly. The sighting stopped around the 1920s, and now many theorize that maybe it was all eyewitness misperceptions and erroneous reports, possibly of the owl flying through low ambient light, which gave off the perception that it was glowing. (1975) A man named Jackson Wright was driving along with his wife, making a trip from New Jersey to New York City, which required him to travel through the Lincoln Tunnel. As they made their way through, Jackson would note that the condensation had built up on the window so much he could no longer see. He decided to pull over and began wiping away the condensation from the front window, while his wife, Martha, jumped out and went to the back and began wiping the rear window off. But after a few seconds, when she didn't return, Jackson turned around to see what she was doing. It was then that he realized she was gone. He got out to look and seen nothing at all. Oddly, there had been nothing else unusual take place. He hadn't heard anything suspicious, and obviously had not seen anything. He reported his wife missing, and of course, police didn't buy his story, so they investigated him. But they could never find any evidence that Jackson was responsible for her disappearance, and Martha was never seen again. The story was found in multiple places that discuss mysteries online, and its wording is almost identical, although there are slight variations in the tellings, like some sources state that it took place during a snowstorm, and that Jackson told authorities there were no other cars in the tunnel at the time, nor was she outside the car long enough to run away or get abducted. However, the thing about this mystery that makes it stand out is the theory, which is that Martha fell into a portal. And I mean, if the story truly happened like it is recorded, I guess it's conceivable, but let's take a closer look at the story. First, I have to point out, I could never verify when and where this story popped up online. However, looking at the paranormal section of the About.com website via the Wayback Machine, it shows maybe the first appearance of the story, and although it's not dated, the Wayback Machine first captured it in 2011. Pretty much every other page online discussing this mystery pops up after this, and with so little information about it, and really no verified sources, we're left with a much more plausible theory that this story is nothing more than an urban legend. In fact, some of the people pointed out that the Lincoln Tunnel always has traffic in it, even during a snowstorm, and the odds that the Wrights happened to be driving through and pulled over and did not see one other vehicle the entire time is very unlikely. Some have even taken it a step further and searched marriage records for a Jackson and Martha Wright, and none matching the details predating 1975 exist. So if it is an urban legend, where did it come from? The oldest available source I could find cites a 1993 book called Poltergeist and the Paranormal, where the author states Mrs. Wright was 36 years old when she vanished. Now how did the author, a man named Reuben Stone, come across this story? I have no idea, but it's likely just an urban legend he had heard previously. Of course, some still dispute this and claim that she did fall into a portal and time traveled somewhere, while others suggest that she was abducted by aliens. Others claim that Jackson was real and made up the whole story and never even had a wife. I'll let you decide in the comment section below. July 30th, 1903, Salt Lake City, Utah. A local newspaper, the Salt Lake Telegram, would publish their daily release, and it had a very interesting headline. It read, "Monster that swims and flies is sighted on Stansbury Island shores. Hunters tell a wild and woolly story of beast that wears an armor of crystal salt." Now obviously, that would intrigue many readers. The story would go on to detail a creature that was around 15 feet long and had the head of an alligator, huge serrated teeth, with a mouth that opened just enough to eat a horse. It was scaly, but the scales were encrusted with salt. It had huge eyes that were round and were made of bright red light. It also had bat-like wings that were about 100 feet wide. The creature was allegedly spotted by several people along the southern portion of Great Salt Lake. In fact, two hunters, a Martin Gilbert and John Berry, went to the island to study the animal for a period of 3 days. They would document the creature's day-to-day activities, where it was apparently recorded flying in the air, laying in the beach sand, and submerging in the water of the lake. The men estimated that it was between 50 and 65 feet from head to tail. Luckily for them, they were always able to view the beast hidden from a long distance away. Although at one point, the animal did soar directly overhead, about 300 yards away, where it circled them. Fearing they were about to be attacked, they would shoot the beast with a rifle. They believed they hit it since the beast let out a cry, half snort and roar, and then flew away. As it flew off, lumps of salt fell to the ground. This encounter did not scare the men off, as they crept inland and found footprints that led to a cave, but they were too afraid to go inside. But they did record the tracks were five-toed and looked like a giant hand. They hid near the cave the rest of the day and waited for it. About an hour later, it returned to its lair with a large horse in its mouth. It took it inside the cave, and the men heard it feasting on it. The men snuck away back to the camp, and if it had not been for a leak in their boat, they would have left that night. Instead, they stayed up all night repairing it. But later, the Great Salt Lake Dragon would return overhead. The men flipped the boat over and hid under it. They cleverly set one end of the boat on a rock, which allowed them to view out and watch the dragon. As it landed on the beach and began feeding on shrimp, the dragon would finally leave, and the men eventually made it back home safely. But that leaves the question, what to make of this story? Was this another one of those cases of the old newspapers telling tall tales to increase sales, or was there something to this account? Interestingly, this story was right next to an ad for the Keith O'Brien Company, a department store that opened in Salt Lake the year before. It was owned by two men named David Keith and Thomas Kearns, and Kearns, coincidentally, owned the newspaper where the article was at. And in what most likely was not a coincidence, this same department store sold tickets for a nighttime train ride that went through the Provo Canyon area, well within range of the alleged dragon sighting. So most likely, the whole story was nothing more than an advertisement for this store and that train ride. However, I have to point out that for the next several decades, the story was taken as legit, and theories were put forward to speculate what the men really seen. The top theory was that it was actually a large pelican that looked bigger due to atmospheric conditions over the lake. Furthermore, a modern-day team researching the story went to the island multiple times between 2018 and 2020 looking for any kind of evidence that would verify the story. They even searched the cave where the monster allegedly stayed, yet they could find no hard evidence to verify the story. Although, they did end up finding chunks of pure salt under a mountain overhang, which was unusual as there was no natural salt buildup nearby, leaving open the thought that the salt may have actually came from the creature's body as described in the story. (1650) In Liérganes, a small village in northern Spain, a man named Francisco de la Vega, the patriarch of a family that had 4 sons, would pass away, leaving the mother, Maria del Casar, in a tight situation. With Francisco no longer able to provide for the family, she decided to send one of her sons to Bilbao to learn a trade as a carpenter. This son, whose name was Francisco de la Vega Casar, would then continue living in the city, practicing his trade until 1674, when something tragic would happen. He, along with some friends, decided to go for a swim in the estuary, and although details are not clear, Francisco, who was said to be a good swimmer, got pulled away by the currents of the river and could never make his way back to shore. His friends last seen him swimming into the sea, and he was never seen again, and assumed to be drowned. But we fast forward 5 years, and things get crazy, because in 1679, fishermen off the Bay of Cadiz in southern Spain had gotten something entangled in their nets. As they pulled it up, it kept trying to fight its way out. They spotted it, and it was a strange-looking creature. The men reacted quickly and tried to pull it up on the ship, but the creature was able to wiggle away and escape. This was only the beginning, because in the following weeks, several fishermen from the area would report seeing the same creature, but were never able to capture it, until one clever fisherman got the idea to trick the creature using loaves of bread. Finally, they got it on board, and upon closer inspection, they seen a young man with white skin and thin red hair. Yet, it wasn't completely human, as they had some fish-like signs, such as a strip of scales that went down his throat to his stomach, while another one covered his spine. He also had gills around his neck. These men had no idea what they were dealing with, so they decided to take the beast to the convent of St. Francis nearby, where he was then exorcised and interrogated in several languages, without any success. But days after this, the being finally said one word, Liérganes, which nobody knew the meaning of. The story spread around town, and after a few days, a sailor from northern Spain would relay to them that there was a small town in the northern part of the country called Liérganes. Soon, the secretary of the Holy Office also confirmed that there was a village called Liérganes near the city of Santander, so the bishop sent word to Santander about the creature, hoping someone would have a clue what was going on. However, they had no idea about the creature either, although one odd thing had happened just 5 years earlier. That was the alleged drowning of Francisco de la Vega, who was also red-haired. But that's not the end of this bizarre story. A friar in the convent where the fish man was being kept postulated that this could indeed be Francisco de la Vega, so after getting permission, he took the creature back to Liérganes. Once they got close to town, the fish man was let free, and he took the friar directly into town, and then went to the house of Maria del Casar, who identified him as her son. Not knowing what else to do, they decided to just leave him with his family. He spent the rest of his days living a quiet, yet weird life, such as he always went barefoot and would walk around nude unless he was specifically given clothing to wear. He also rarely talked, although sometimes he would mutter words like tobacco, bread, or wine, but strangely, he did not seem to want to smoke, eat, or drink, and when he did eat, he consumed quite a lot greedily, and then he could not eat for another week or so. He was kind as well, and if his family asked him to do a simple task, he would, although he didn't seem excited about it. He even had a job sorta like a mailman where he delivered letters to neighboring towns. He even swam 3 miles across the Bay of Santander to deliver one letter. But he must have got tired of this slow, boring life, because after 9 years, he went to the sea and swam away and was never seen again. So a totally unbelievable, bizarre story, right? Well, where does it come from? See, that's the issue. It actually comes from a pretty reliable source. That of a man named Benito Jeronimo Feju, a Spanish monk and scholar who recorded the accounts taken from several witnesses. In fact, Benito's claim to fame was encouraging other scholars to use scientific research to debunk silly myths and superstitions, aka, he was an early skeptic. So for someone like him to cite this story as fact, well, it means it's at least worth taking a look at. For one, Benito gives a ton of details, dates, and names of people who corroborated the events. When he first heard the tale, he thought it sounded fishy, pun intended. He believed there was no way possible that it could be real, and he set out to debunk it. After reviewing the records and testimonies carefully, he set out to interview eyewitnesses in the area where the fish man appeared. He would document this in 1720, which is 46 years after the events took place in 1674. So many of the young people at the time these events occurred were still alive, and he had no shortage of witnesses who all confirmed that the story was indeed true. And these witnesses were not just fishermen. Several of the sources were the educated people from the time, including the Marquis of Valbuena, a nobleman, Don Gaspar Matur de la Riba Aguero, and a knight from the Order of Santiago who lived near Liérganes, as well as a Don Dionisio Rubalcaba who knew the fishman. According to Benito, he would confirm that a fishman did appear in Cadiz, was taken to Liérganes, and lived there for some period before he disappeared. But what makes this whole thing even stranger was Benito was not just a skeptic. He was one of those bitter skeptics that went around looking for people to argue with. He took pleasure in destroying people that believed in silly superstitions, and he also liked to debunk fraudsters, so it doesn't seem possible that a man like this would record a fishman story unless he had good reason to do so. So what gives? Well, maybe not surprisingly, stories of fishmen being captured had been recorded in Europe before, so it was not exactly a new thing. The mystery with this one is, like I said, is it possible it truly happened, since Benito, of all people, claimed that it did? Well, centuries later, the most modern take on this story is obviously the Fishman story was fake, but because of the insane amount of testimonies, something was seen. And the most likely theory was this man had what was known as cretinism, or now known as SIDS, congenital iodine deficiency syndrome, which would explain the man being almost mute, his white skin, red hair, and even the so-called scales. It would also explain why the man just wandered around biting his fingernails. The illness was endemic to the region at the time, and the man had most likely wandered to Cadiz, where he was spotted by fishermen, and the story spun out of control from that point. One theory specifically posits that his illness may have been seen as a burden on the family, and they deliberately got rid of him, only for him to show up in southern Spain, where he survived living off the iodine-rich diet from the sea. This next story takes us to another old, now defunct website, that of ghoststudy.com, in what has to be one of the first paranormal websites on the internet, coming online in May of 1999. It's here that people would get together to discuss their own ghost stories, hence the website name, but also discuss pictures and articles and other paranormal related things. One common hobby the users of this site like to do was to go to another website where you could watch webcams that stream 24/7, and these webcams had been set up at locations that were allegedly haunted. This is where the mystery begins, because a user going by the name Kismet would write that he and another member were setting up late chatting one night, something that used to be done fairly common, and they were watching one of these webcam streams together. At some point, they would see a flash of bright light coming from the upper corner of the wall over the stairway, yet no one came downstairs. Then, the real paranormal activity would begin, because the television set, which was turned off all night up to that point, would start flashing images that looked strange. One of these, Kimsa even described as being disturbing. It looked like the face of something, but not really that of a human. He would grab a few screenshots and submit them to the website, which you can see here. One commenter would note how the image seemed to be beyond the boundaries of the TV screen, indicating this was something paranormal. Unfortunately, I couldn't find much more on this one, or this phenomenon in general, although some paranormal enthusiasts do believe ghosts and spirits can use TV or radio to communicate with people, but I couldn't find any other accounts of ghosts actually coming through the TV set, so you can let me know what you think in the comment section below. Buenos Aires, 1927. 29-year-old Benjamin Solari Parravicini was already reaching unprecedented heights in his fast-rising art career. Benjamin had spent most of his entire life dedicated to painting, and here he was now being congratulated by the president of Argentina at an art exhibit which had his paintings on display. He would eventually get an award from an international art display in the capital, and was even invited to exhibit some of his work in Belgium, where he got a gold medal and was even recognized by King Albert I, who bought one of his works. It was clear to all that he had a bright future ahead. In spite of that talent, this was not what Benjamin would be remembered for, because starting in 1936, he would spend close to 4 decades making more than 1,000 of what he called prophetic drawings, which he described as psychographies. Maybe I should back up a little bit. See, Benjamin, this gifted artist, in his childhood had been in contact with fairies, angels, and duendes, which is a goblin-like creature. But that was not all. Benjamin also possessed the gift to find lost objects, and even lost people, with ease. And it's around this time as a child in the early 1900s, he began going on to anyone that would listen about a war that would go off in 14, which, if you study history even a little, you will know that's when World War I began. Benjamin apparently had several premonitions of this war years before it happened, and had warned several people. Which brings us back to 1936, when Benjamin started creating his psychographies. It's this work that his supporters have long claimed his predictions on various world events have came true, and where he would earn his nickname, the Argentinian Nostradamus. One of his earliest predictions was that of satellite communication. The sketch was accompanied by a text that read, "It comes, a new communication system in the world by artificial planets." This piece of art was dated to 1938, while the first communication satellite launched in 1958, so 20 years after he predicted it. But that wasn't his only prediction. In 1938, he also did two pieces of art, one which read, "Artificial motherhood, cultivated," while another read, "The origin will be detracted, man will cultivate without contact." And 40 years later, in 1978, the first baby delivered after the mother received in vitro fertilization occurred. And there were numerous others. In 1960, he described the internet by writing, "An invisible network that will unite the entire world." He also described portable communication devices being used by pretty much everyone. Another piece of art he created was a drawing of a broken wall and the phrase, "The wall will fall," obviously meaning the Berlin Wall. In 1937, he described a bearded leader setting the Antilles on fire, which was supposed to be a prediction of Castro and Cuba. He also stated that humans would make it to space between 1960 and 1970, and in 1938, he predicted an artificial heart would be made by 1966. Another one of the more famous ones came from 1936, when he drew the shape of a double helix accompanied by the text, "The intimate structure of life will be discovered, and the essence of humanity will be understood." Obviously, this one was thought to mean the discovery of DNA, but his biggest prediction was the one that really made him famous, albeit over 30 years after he had already passed away, which was two sketches of the Statue of Liberty. One of these with buildings going down in the background and a message that read, "The freedom of North America will lose its sight. Its torch won't illuminate like yesterday, and the monument will be attacked 2 times, which eerily predicted 9/11. This one he made in 1939. Interestingly, Benjamin claimed he had destroyed a lot of the drawings at first because of his Catholic beliefs, which left him uncomfortable because the drawings did not make sense to him. He also claimed he was not in control when they were completed, and instead, his hand was controlled by an external being, which he claimed was his guardian angel. He also said he heard a voice during the process of creating them. However, critics argue that his drawings and quotes were so vague you could interpret them many different ways, and some of the more famous predictions weren't really that much of a prediction. Take, for example, in vitro fertilization. Although he did make his prediction of the first baby being born this way 40 years before it occurred, scientists had been testing in vitro fertilization on other mammals since 1900, so it wasn't a stretch to believe at some point they would be able to do it on humans. As far as his internet prediction in 1960, well, by the late 1950s, computer scientists were already discussing the possibility of wide area networks, and with the way the space race was going, it was not unreasonable to predict that the US or the Soviets would reach space by the 1960s. Then, if we look at his artificial heart prediction he made in 1938, we see that it came true in 1966. However, the first official heart made was implanted into a dog in 1938, the same year he made his prediction. So a lot of these could have been made just by reading the science magazines at the time. However, some of his predictions, like the 9/11 attacks, are more difficult to explain away, but I leave it to you. Was he legit or just another false prophet? You can let me know in the comment section below. When it comes to conspiracy theories, one of the most famous ones we have all heard is the Illuminati, which is crazy enough by itself, but this next one, the Council of 13, or should I say, the reptilian aliens and the Council of 13 royal families, may be the craziest thing we have ever covered. The theory largely stems from a 2002 book by Stuart Swerdlow called Blue Blood, True Blood, Conflict and Creation. And while there's not much of it online, except the one-page link by the Iceberg, I will try to give a rough summary of this one. Basically, the Illuminati of Earth is comprised of 13 different Illuminati families. These families are known for their power and influence across the globe. These are the Rothschild families, or real name, Bauer family, the Bruce family, the Kennedys, or their real name, Cavendish, de Medici, the Hanovers, the Habsburgs, the Krupps, the Plantagenets, the Rockefellers, the Romanovs, the Sinclairs, or St. Clairs, the Warbers, or real name, Del Banco, and the Windsor family, aka the Saxe-Coburg-Goth. All of these families are responsible for different aspects of the world, whether that's finance, military, technology, media, religion, or whatever. Now the leader of this council of 13 families is called the Pindar, and it's always a male from one of these families, and the term Pindar is supposed to be an abbreviation of Pinnacle of the Draco, but it's also known as Penis of the Dragon, and I have no idea why, but the holder of this rank reports to the purebred reptilian leader in Inner Earth, and at the time of the 2002 publication of the book, that leader was from the Rothschild family. I can sense I'm starting to lose some of you, but hang on, it gets worse. Below the Council of 13 is the Committee of 300. These are the supporting families with the highest percentage of reptilian DNA, such as the Bush family, the Carnegies, the Fords, the Roosevelts, Rockefellers, and Rothschilds, obviously. They, along with the Council of 13, control the CIA, NSA, Mossad, and basically every intelligence organization in the world, along with the Federal Reserve, the Bilderbergs, etc., etc. They are obsessed with symbolism, like pyramids and the reptilian eyes on the dollar bill, and the number 13 holds significant importance to them, hence why there's 13 ruling families, and why there were 13 founding colonies. Speaking of the 13 colonies, the Council of 13 also created fake countries like the United States, Soviet Union, Israel, the UK, Central and South America, and most of the black majority countries in Africa. And in their downtime, they helped start the American Civil War to split up the United States and double their profits, while also elevating slavery to a more subtle masked form. They also orchestrated World War I so they could test out chemical warfare and reduce the global population. Plus, it was time to restructure Europe, while they started World War II to test out mind control techniques and to start the use of fluoride, and of course, nuclear weapons. Speaking of nukes, the reason Japan was nuked was because the Japanese Illuminati, represented by Emperor Hirohito, was trying to take over, and the Japanese Illuminati has never been viewed as legitimate anyways. And don't think they are going to let the Native Americans off scot-free either. They planned the genocide of the native population. Tragedies such as the Trail of Tears, yeah, that was an Illuminati plan. As of 2002, when the book was written, the election of George W. Bush was supposed to be a sign that they were making progress towards their goal of global control. I never thought I'd come across a topic that made me miss the pooper mysteries, but here we are. Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and Elon Musk. What do these three men have in common? Well, outside of being extremely wealthy, they all share one other thing. That is, in spite of the vast amount of money they have, they are still nowhere near the level of the richest man in history, that of the Malian ruler in the 14th century, Mansa Musa. His wealth, when adjusted for the modern day, would be the equivalent of $4 billion, twice that of Musk, which he attained by controlling the lucrative salt trade, as well as having control over a vast amount of gold mines in Africa, as well as being involved in the trade of ivory, slaves, spices, silks, and ceramics. In 1324, he set off on a pilgrimage to Mecca, nearly 2,700 miles away, with thousands of men bringing tons of gifts. In Cairo, he gave out so much gold that it caused the value of it to be affected in all of Egypt. But it's this stop in Cairo that our topic comes about. When staying there, he would meet the governor and tell him a story about his predecessor, a man known by the Arabic name Abu Bakr II, real name Mondi Bakari. According to Musa, Bakr had abdicated the Malian throne and embarked on a great expedition across the Atlantic Ocean. Actually, there were 2 expeditions. The first one used 200 ships, which was led by an unnamed explorer. This expedition would be gone for a long time, and only 1 ship made it back. The ship's captain told Bakr that in the open sea, they came to a river with a powerful current, presumably the Canary Current, and they forged ahead except for this 1 ship that did not go, and instead waited on the others to return, yet they never did. Bakr did not believe this account, so he took a second expedition with 2,000 ships, along with sailors, builders, and enough craftsmen to last for several years, this one led by Bakr himself. However, the fate of this voyage is unknown, because Abu Bakr never returned, which allowed Musa to claim the throne. But other than this king's account, there's little supporting evidence which shows this, although if this expedition was lost at sea, it might explain why. In fact, some so-called revisionist historians cite the theory that Abu Bakr set off across the Atlantic in 1311, thus handing over his throne to Musa, and that the reason it was not passed down through African oral history is because they sought to cover this up because fleeing the throne was viewed as cowardly and dishonorable. The theory further states that the fleet made landfall, discovering a forested countryside similar to Mali's landscape, presumably Brazil, where he set up a colony and traded with the local indigenous people, and then sent that money back to Mali and waited for ships to return with supplies and settlers to establish farms. The so-called colony was named Born Bambouk, after the famous goldfields in Mali. This colony was supposed to be near the modern-day city, Recife, and it was here over the next 2 centuries did Mali become the center of a vast trade network stretching from the Aztec Empire to India, with locations such as Mandinga Port, Mandinga Bay, and Sierra de Mali, either located in Haiti or Mexico, depending on the source. But is there any actual real proof of this? A lot of this comes from a couple of records from the earliest days of Spanish exploration. Many often cite Columbus, who, according to the theory, may have not been looking for a route to Asia, but instead was investigating claims of West African ships trading with a continent southwest of Africa. But Columbus supposedly spoke of seeing a black people in the Americas who carried gold-tipped spears. But Columbus never recorded this. He wrote that there were natives who painted themselves black. However, Bartolomé de las Casas did write that they had received reports from the Indians of Hispaniola of a black people to the south and southeast who made the tops of their spears with a metal called guanin, which when tested was made of a majority of gold. However, since Columbus had already previously cited the natives who painted themselves black, it is more than likely the natives that told Bartolomé de las Casas this were indeed citing these painted peoples. But proponents of this theory ignore that, and sometimes even take it a step further and claim that Abu Bakr went on to influence native culture, in particular that of the Olmecs, who are a pretty mysterious people on their own. A lot of this comes down to the colossal stone heads built by the Olmec, which, looking at them, you may think they actually look like an African warrior, instead of a Native American one. In addition, Vasco Núñez de Balboa even recorded seeing Native Americans who wore head wraps with patterns just like the ones he's seen in Guinea in West Africa, as well as seeing a black-skinned people held as prisoners in a Native American prison. However, the skeptical answer to this is that Balboa was actually just seeing a member of another Native American tribe. However, as you might imagine, this research is viewed by historians as incredibly flawed. Although most concede it was possible that Bakr did make it to the New World, or any West Africans actually, some would even say it wasn't only possible, but likely, which might explain why some of the earliest European explorers spoke of it. Yet, it's almost for certain there wasn't any trade going on back and forth. There's just no data that supports that Bakr was sending fleets of assorted goods and treasures back to Africa after his trip. If anything, any African expeditions were just popping in for a short amount of time like the Vikings did. In fact, some historians believe Mansa Musa's story about Abu Bakr going on these expeditions may have been nothing more than a clever ruse, stating that it was possible he had Bakr deposed of and then made up the story to explain how he got power. Furthermore, Abu Bakr never ruled Mali, although it's assumed by most historians that Bakr was Mansa Muhammad ibn Ku, the real ruler before Musa. But if he really did make this expedition, there's no record it returned, and the fleet's fate is uncertain. It's possible they encountered fierce storms near South America and were shipwrecked. July 22nd, 1992, Wisconsin. A 32-year-old man named Tracy Edwards went to the home of another 32-year-old man named Jeffrey Dahmer. Edwards had been considering letting Dahmer photograph him nude for $100, but was still unsure. As he hung around hoping to get a little bit more comfortable, Dahmer would get Edwards to focus on a fish tank he had. As he stood there looking, out of nowhere, Dahmer would try to handcuff him and failed at first, but he did eventually get them on. Edwards, obviously scared, was led to the bedroom where Dahmer had the movie Exorcist III playing. He would then brandish a knife and tell Edwards he was going to take nude pics of him. Edwards, most likely knowing he needed to act now or never escape, would tell Dahmer he had no issues with him taking the photos if he would just uncuff him and put the knife away. Dahmer did this favor and began watching the movie. He then began rocking back and forth, eerily chanting. He then pulled the knife out again and told Edwards he was going to eat his heart. At this point, Edwards knew it was now or never. He would tell him he needed to use the bathroom and ask if they could sit in the living room afterwards where there was an air conditioner. Dahmer said yes and stood up and walked into the living room after Edwards exited the bathroom. After sitting a few minutes, Edwards waited for another opening and said he needed to use the bathroom again. When he stood up from the couch, he punched Dahmer in the face and ran out the door, and the rest is history. The police would show up and Dahmer would go to prison. But that's not our mystery. It's what Edwards told investigators later where our conspiracy begins. Edwards told detectives when Dahmer first went from the friendly guy who asked him to come over to the guy brandishing a knife, he had changed. He said his face seemed different, his body structure, he was a totally different guy, which leads to the totally bizarre theory that Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the most notorious serial killers ever, was a shapeshifter. Apparently after he captured Edwards and thought he couldn't escape, he no longer had to hide this fact. And also, if he was a shapeshifter, it might explain why it took police so long to capture him. The theory got its start from one of the most popular 90s TV shows, The X-Files. When writer Chris Carter heard the comment by Edwards about Jeffrey Dahmer and took it and ran with it. In fact, the episode, called Irresistible, is one of the highest rated in the show's history and one of the most critically acclaimed. Unlike other X-Files episodes, it's about a serial killer, and there is no overt paranormal elements, although it is hinted at that the villain, a man named Donnie Faster, who was based on Dahmer, had the ability to shapeshift, although some fans of the show actually believe the villain Donnie was really a demon and not a shapeshifter. Regardless, Carter, who wrote the episode, would comment later on about the inspiration for the Donnie character. Quote, "There are reports of people who had been under the spell of Jeffrey Dahmer who actually claimed that he shapeshifted during those hours when they were held hostage, that his image actually changed." End quote. However, I think Carter might be taking Edwards' characterization of Dahmer a little too literal, as I could not find anything else about Dahmer being a shapeshifter, although I could totally see him being a demon. But what do you think? That brings us to the conclusion of the Obscure Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg Explained, Part 6. I hope you all enjoyed. Goodbye, and good night.